So can we prove that God exists? I think there are evidential trails, but not proof in the sense of a mathematical proof like 2 + 2 = 4.
The interesting thing with this is, I actually don't agree. I think this shows a fundamental misunderstanding of what exactly mathematics is. Now, in case you haven't seen, there's a great video which explains the process of generating mathematical truths, and it's nothing more than pure outright definitions and an adherence to logical consistency. So here's where I disagree with the video, because I think you can prove God exists with a similar formula. And what's more amazing is there is an argument that does just that. So, ladies and gentlemen, meet the modal ontological argument for the existence of God. So the interesting thing is there are a set of arguments which reaches the conclusion that God exists that are derived from sources other than observation of the world. In other words, from reason alone. What this means is, the modal ontological argument is nothing more than analytic a priori necessary premises to the conclusion that God exists. Now that all sounds very fancy to the philosophically illiterate, and it might even sound convincing. But here's the problem. What this means is, the ontological argument, or in this specific case the modal ontological argument, it's just a set of premises which lead to the conclusion God exists by definition. What's the problem with that, I hear you ask? Well, saying something is by definition anything means you're talking about an analytic proposition. They're propositions whose truth is knowable by knowing the meaning of the constituent words alone. The simplest example is the phrase, all unmarried men are bachelors, because all you need to know is the definition of the terms and Bob's your uncle. Although what this sentence is really saying is that all unmarried men are unmarried men. This is what happens when you say something is by definition what it is. So how does this link with the modal ontological argument? Well, here's inspiring philosophy to explain.
Alvin Plantinga's modal ontological argument is probably the best argument for the existence of God. It uses the laws of modal logic and acts similar to a mathematical proof.
Pure logic, in and of itself, cannot generate rote facts about the external world. That is a huge misconception religious apologists consistently fail to grasp, as if all you need to do in order to figure out the deepest mysteries of the cosmos is just sit in an armchair and think really hard about stuff. Well, no, I'm sorry guys, but the world doesn't work that way. Logic is not some magical looking glass into the underlying essence of reality. Rather, what logic can do is tell you whether or not the propositions you use to describe reality have been properly stuck together. This is why, without even looking at a single premise, we can already be perfectly confident that the modal ontological argument is going to fail. It's a little thing called the analytic-synthetic distinction, and you can't just casually sidestep it like it doesn't exist. Anytime we talk about logical and mathematical proofs, we can only be talking about examples of purely analytic propositions. That means whatever truth we claim to know is only going to come from the raw meaning of the words themselves. But the moment you start talking about things and relationships existing out there in the real world, then now we're making synthetic propositions. And here, the coin of the realm is pragmatic empirical evidence. What decisions can I now make in the real world with real empirical consequences that will manifest under the expectation that a divine cosmic agent exists somewhere? So the moment this guy claims that he can prove God's existence using nothing more than the laws of logic, independently of any physical evidence, mind you, then he has just admitted that he doesn't know what the hell he's talking about.
Skeptics will pull a quote from Alvin Plantinga to try to say that he thinks the argument doesn't work. In The Nature of Necessity, Plantinga says, "It must be conceded, however, that argument A is not a successful piece of natural theology, for the latter typically draws its premises from a stock of propositions accepted by nearly every sane man, or perhaps nearly every rational man. Hence, our verdict on these reformulated versions of St. Anselm's argument must be as follows. They cannot perhaps be said to prove or establish their conclusion."
And therein lies the fundamental problem, straight from the horse's mouth. The problem with the argument is it's either circular or a tautology. So take your pick. It's equivalent to saying, things that exist, exist. Things that exist necessarily are a subset of things that exist. Therefore, things that exist necessarily exist. Maximally great beings are beings that exist necessarily. Therefore, maximally great beings exist. God is a maximally great being. Therefore, God exists. The problem with the argument is that it can't even get off the ground. To put it simply, concluding God is not the same as demonstrating him. In other words, going from X is possible to therefore exists in the actual world is disingenuous at best. Now, there are a myriad of objections to the argument we can get into as well as a number of parodies of the ontological argument. But to put it simply, the modal ontological argument is not proof of the existence of a being which possesses maximal greatness. As Alvin Plantinga himself has said, our verdict on these reformulated versions of Saint Anselm's argument must be as follows. They cannot, perhaps, be said to prove or establish their conclusion, but since it's rational to accept the central premise, they show that it's rational to accept that conclusion. But to put it simply, it eventually boils down to
Premise 1. There is sufficient evidence to justify belief in the existence of God. Premise 2. There is not sufficient evidence to justify the existence of something or some state of affairs which is incompatible with the existence of God. Conclusion. Therefore, belief in the existence of God is justified. Now, as you read this, you might be thinking, isn't this just a formulation of what it means to justify any evidential claim? In fact, it isn't even in and of itself an argument. And you would be correct.
But to see why, I recommend you head over to No More's video to find out exactly why that's the case. And here's Anti-Citizen X to explain, perhaps in the only way fitting, why this argument fails.
Premise 1. If God exists, then God is a necessary entity. Your words verbatim. Premise 2. Necessary entities are entities that exist in all possible worlds, by definition. Premise 3. Entities that exist in all possible worlds are entities that exist in the actual world, by axiomatic set theory. Premise 4. Entities that exist in the actual world are entities that exist, by definition. Conclusion, therefore, from premise 1, if God exists, then God is, by definition, an entity that exists. Congratulations, dipshit. You just asserted your own conclusion via the law of identity. If God exists, well then, gee, I guess God exists.
On a similar note, the next video I'll be discussing is whether life is designed or not. So I hope you can join me for that. On which note, I must say, thank you so much for watching. It's been a pleasure, as always, and I'll see you next time.